All right, here we go with the third lesson of Unit 7, the Roaring Twenties, Prohibition, Nativism, and Intolerance. There's a snap chart for you. Characteristics of society focusing on prohibition, the growth of nativism, and intolerance. Our prohibition topic goes way back into a religious movement. If you recall, we talked about it before, the Second Great Awakening. The American Temperance Society was formed in 1826 up in the Northeast in that place called Boston, Massachusetts. They were into anything but alcohol and, of course, slavery. In 1851, in the same region, the state of Maine made itself dry with the dry laws. Lyman Beecher was a father. Neil Dow was the father of that particular movement. Is kind of considered to be the father of the Prohibition movement and the beginnings of an actual state going dry. In 1869, the Prohibition Party was formed. It's still an organization around today. Don't drink alcohol, right? And as we've talked about before, in 1873, there's this organization connected to women, and the Second Great Awakening involved a lot of women with a lot of reforms, women's suffrage being one of them, and suffrage being connected to this, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and Molly Hatchet, the infamous Carrie Nation, her real name, president of the organization that had some women and herself going into bars and chopping up barrels and bottles of alcohol. In 1900, the Anti-Saloon League was formed. There's a major emphasis on this being a moral degradation of society, or causing the moral degradation of society, impacting women and children heavily. This is one of the reasons why women want the right to vote in 1919. They get it with the 19th Amendment. But gradually, as we've talked about here in the West, our reform starts to happen in the West heavily. In the South, it's popular in rural America, not as popular in in the Northeast and in the coasts. And if you look at the coding here, these white states are completely dry prohibition states. Pretty cool movie to watch. Check that out. You might have seen the modern version. Check out the original with Kevin Bacon. It kind of has that kind of a prohibition kind of a theme to it. And it's also centered around dancing and that kind of thing. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. The beginnings, of course, again, as we said, go way back, but the 18th Amendment is where it becomes a nationwide thing. Again, our reform movements tend to start up at the bottom and move their way to the top if they happen. The women's suffrage movement the same way, with changes in suffrage happening at the state level out in the West, moving into the East, and the effort to conserve alcohol here during the war, to win the war, to progress as a nation and to protect democracy and progress the world. This was the thing that brings alcohol into a national spotlight and to us theoretically being a dry country. If you read the words of and the language of the 18th Amendment, after 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States, fix my typo there, from the United States, and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is prohibited. There is one thing that it did not prohibit. It is the drinking of alcohol. This might be a problem. There is a demand for it, therefore, so somebody's going to figure out a way to supply it. That means big money being made. It's enforced by an act that's passed afterward. Every amendment is open to another act being passed. Work out the details of how you're going to make the amendment work, become reality. It was establishing 1,500 federal agents across the entire nation. Its emphasis was to make sure that, and hopefully the idea was it was going to be enforced by the states on a local level, but that wasn't going to happen. Wasn't very realistic. Consequences of all this: people start making their own alcohol, i.e. bathtub gin, literally made of the bathtub. Secret spots to go ahead and obtain and or drink alcohol, what's called speakeasies. You would have to have a particular password to get in. Speak easy about this place, because if the wrong people hear about it, it's going to get busted. Bootlegging alcohol. The origins of the muscle car. Check out this series from the 70s, the Dukes of Hazzard, has that bootlegging and making of alcohol theme in it. And even speedboats, smuggling from Cuba, Latin America, to Florida, to Jacksonville, to Tampa. That's coming out of the Caribbean, Latin America, and across the borders, Canada, and through Mexico. There is a massive demand all of a sudden for those that all of a sudden legally are not supposed to have it in their possession. You can drink it, but you can't have it in your possession, supply it, move it, transport it. This, of course, brings about the formation of organized crime, the most famous being Al Capone, the infamous Scarface, controlling part of Chicago, largely ignoring the law in most parts of the urban areas of the country, It was easier to enforce in the countryside in rural America, as you saw the map before. The origins of Prohibition are there. There's more of a religious element and belief that this is the way things should be, and we should apply, that dry alcohol interpretation from the religious beliefs to everyday living. And so we literally have kind of a urban versus rural kind of a split here in all this. But it was also a problem in rural areas also. But in rural areas, it was far more easily supported. The Ku Klux Klan, for example, is very much, for the most part, pro-prohibition because of the idea that a lot of the anti-alcohol people were immigrants. Immigrants didn't believe in this prohibition thing. And so the two were connected, and so that's another reason why we should keep immigrants out. Our topic later on. Consumption drops, but then it goes back up. Why does that happen? Well, perhaps because of the immediate impact of the war here. If we look from, about 1917, which is our beginning of the war here, to our involvement in the war, World War I, to 1919, right? We're conserving resources and focusing it on the war, and then the amendment is passed, and it drops even further, and then organized crime, people figure out how to supply it and get it back into the public. So it doesn't really ever completely go away. It declines a little bit, but it generally comes back. The effect on people in society, it became kind of a fashionable thing, breaking the law, resistance to the man, the system, that kind of thing. It became a status symbol, especially amongst the nation's youth. People became attracted to the illegality of it, but it also became more dangerous to consume because there was no regulation over the production of it. People were just making it on their own, and it became very strong, or in some cases they would water it down to try and make more money that way. Another film to check out in terms of dealing with the crime and the crime syndicate and organized crime and the mob and the mafia, The Untouchables. Excellent film. Check that out, The Hunt for Al Capone. Other problems include the enforcement. Really no one was clearly in charge. Theoretically the federal government, but the states were also, and there just wasn't enough, and there wasn't enough push and emphasis behind it. Law officers, law enforcement really weren't behind it. Crime, again, as we mentioned before, increases. The court system and the prison system becomes overloaded with people convicted of, breaking the law. It just wasn't working. They weren't ready for it. It was just a little bit too big. There's also the fact that since there was big money in the bootlegging of it, this extra money was given to public officials, to police officers, to judges, to kind of look the other way. This is how Al Capone got off, and many others got off of any crimes that they committed in attempts to put them in jail. Al Capone, by the way, will go to jail because he was not paying his taxes on his illegal alcohol profits. And that's how they eventually get him to go to prison. Alcatraz, by the way. Lost sorts of income tax revenue, the sales of alcohol, and that usually was happening at the state level, so there's a drain on public money and taxation for the government here. And of course, it costs money to enforce this. And so you've got a negative and a negative here, increased spending and the loss of revenue here. Not a good thing. At the same time, since this seemed to be a little bit more difficult and challenging to get or risky to get, people started looking also to other illicit stimulants and drugs, opium, marijuana, patent medicines, cocaine, things like that. These things weren't necessarily completely illegal on a national federal law scale at this time, and so these became a little bit more attractive and involved in society's use. Other problems were that the United States government actually provided people with recipes on how to make alcohol. If you wrote to the Department of Agriculture, you could get the information on how to do that. Of course, alcohol is made from grain. This, by the way, is probably something that's not good for farmers. And at the same time, it hurts the farm economy. And not good there, right? Farmers always kind of taking a hit most of the time, except for during the wars, things are pretty good for the most part. This is an advertisement on a kit you can buy at the time to go ahead and make it. And so there are all kinds of ways around it and things that were examples of holes in the system. Some of the holes in the system involve that the details of the Volstead Act allowed for you to get medical use prescriptions. It was, of course, still utilized in the communions and churches in the United States. It was allowed there yet, but you could easily get a medicinal prescription from your doctor in many cases for this alcohol. All right, so Prohibition. We're trying to become dry, become morally, straight, clean ourselves up, save people, save money, that kind of thing. Save the children, allow the women to be better mothers, to fight evil things like alcohol. But at the same time, we've got this ugly thing that's still rising in us, and this growth of nativism, a response to our experience in World War I, on American things and American people. Foreign intolerance is big here. The Klan rises significantly in membership and in influence. One of the key turning points in this was a film, considered the first blockbuster film in our history, 3 hours long. It was called The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, and it was based on a book called The Klansman, a historical romance of the Klan. I don't know how many people would associate romance with the Klan, but it basically glorifies the South before the Civil War, Southern society, the relationship between people of the races, the slaves, the slave owners was good, and once slavery is gone, it kind of highlights the notion that, white society was in a state of threat, of being attacked. Scenes of white women being attacked by freed men, things of that nature. This was a big deal. President Wilson saw it and said it was the greatest thing that we've seen, and he thought it was a wonderful production. And with that, the Klan got kind of this little bit of a boost. And at the same time, now this is the time, talking about immigration, we have that new immigration coming into the country. At top of that, post-World War I economic hardship is being experienced by most of the country. And when there's economic hardship, people tend to blame other people. They're taking my job, minorities, immigrants driving down my wages, things of that nature. And this new immigration, as we talked about before, make sure you note that for yourself if you kind of forgot, Southern Eastern European, largely Catholic, other cultures, also some radical ideas within them, some anarchists, people with more of a socialist, communist mindset from Southern Eastern Europe. And again, our reaction to World War I is part of all this. The Klan no longer is a secret organization. It is a wide open, in-your-face, we are here. And they literally are here not only in just the public and parades like this in Washington, D.C. in 1925, but they are elected officials in government, especially the South. We know that was the case after the Reconstruction. But they also find people and get members in other sections of the country. Judges, politicians, governors, legislators. And the greatest growth in all of this happened in Midwestern states. Now, if you recall, remember with our Industrial Revolution, that great migration, that great migration, African Americans and some whites too, moving into the North, wanting better jobs, better paying jobs, moving into white societies, causing conflict. Red Summer 1919, that racial tension made the Klan more attractive, and some Southerners perhaps that were going to the North, of course, brought that with them. Illinois, Indiana, especially Indiana, seeing some of the biggest rises in Klan membership, right? And so the mixing of the country from the Industrial Revolution and World War I really putting the Great Migration into a high gear causes this membership to rise, the resistance of people not like us moving into our society, our communities, all that kind of thing. So nativism rears its ugly head in the 1920s. And again, the past, we've got in the 1850s, the Know Nothing Party, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic. In 1887, the American Protective Association, right, in our new immigration wave response here also, concerned about these new immigrants, Catholics, people of other cultural European descent that were seen as lesser, and then that whole Philippine annexation thing was considered to be a negative deal. And so we have this being a factor here. And again, the Klan, Protestant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, anti-Catholic, is sitting on the Pope, right? This is what America is. There's a movement as the Catholic population grows of the development of private Catholic schools, religious schools, right? This cartoon kind of highlights that. And of course, since the Reconstruction, we have the establishment of all kinds of hurdles, political hurdles, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, that kind of thing, that are standing in the way, that are supported by that Democratic South and the Ku Klux Klan being the enforcers of the democratic society in the South, or democratic-minded people in the South. The Klan is not just about keeping freedmen in their place anymore. They're about anybody that's not, again, American. White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestants, WASPs. So in the latter part of the 19th century, especially in the 1890s, got a significant number of lynchings. 82% of them were black. Of the known number of lynchings, you could be white, you could be Mexican, you could be any, if you weren't American Protestant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were in jeopardy. And so it's a violent time, as we know, we talked about before, all the way into the 1950s. In the 1960s, the concern of African Americans voting, perhaps not. Voting really drops almost to near zero levels in some places because of the situation here and the threats. Just live. And that would be, I guess you might say, Booker T. Washington's argument. Just go ahead and do yourself a favor and earn a better living, and don't push hard for political rights. We'll get it gradually as we prove ourselves economically and lift ourselves up economically. This is a very visual thing. It is not meant to be hidden. It is meant to be in your face, the enforcement of stay in your place throughout the country, especially the South. Here, a postcard showing a lynching in broad daylight. The back of the postcard, which says this: postcards bought in dime stores, drug stores, stores throughout the South, right? Sometimes at night. This is a very, very strong way of saying this is the way things are here. Happens in the North as well, Duluth, Minnesota. In response to all this, especially even with the lack of change after World War I and freedmen or African Americans who served in the war not seeing change at home, increased membership in the NAACP, formed out of the Niagara Movement and W.E.B. Du Bois, take legal action, again different from Booker T. Washington, the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, still around here yet today, primarily a response to what was going on in World War I, a radical response to those who were anti-war, what was un-American, free speech, the Sedition Acts, conscientious objectors. This organization got together to represent the right to dissent or to speak your mind and to speak freely. Eugene V. Debs went to jail for that, and many others, and were deported for speaking out against the war. And of course, this is still around here yet today. At the same time in the 1920s, an organization was formed for Mexican Americans and Latino Americans. In the United States, large numbers of migrant workers coming here to work in the fields, work in some steel mills, and some factories as well. They were very much the target of lynching and violence. And they were very much spread throughout heavily in small towns and rural areas, not connected. And this organization is established to try and get them together to form some sort of a resistance and to represent their rights at this point in time in history. Thus, again, a response to the violence, and you have a chart there of what's there. Make sure you read your documents on how Mexican Americans were treated and what kind of work they were required to do, were kind of fitted into in society when they came here. No LULAC. So there is a little bit of kickback and protection and response to civil liberties here in all this. Again, with our post-war time period, there are a series of immigration laws. We know that the Chinese Exclusion Act is the first one that is passed in 1883, 1887, right in there. I always forget that date. It's somewhere right in there. Double check it. But in our new immigration and coinciding with the World War I, there's the Immigration Act of 1917 is passed. President Wilson vetoed it, but it was overridden by Congress. It basically imposed literacy tests and largely, almost completely barred any immigration from the Asian Pacific part of the world. After that, in 1921, right after the war, economic stress, lots of union strikes, Red Summer 1919, the Emergency Quota Act is passed. And this sets up a quota system for immigrants from each nation. And it's going to last until 1965. And it said basically that 3% of any group that's already in the United States, so if there's 100,000 in the United States that are from Russia in 1910, if there were 100,000 from Russia in 1910 in the United States, then that meant 3% of those could come into the country in any given year. But if you went to 1910 and said how many Germans were here or how many Englishmen were here, there were far larger numbers, so therefore the 3% for Northern and Western Europeans was much, much larger. Right? And so the Quota Act favored them, and it was a targeted effort to limit the number of undesirables, Catholics, people with radical thinking, and just not as American as we would like them to be, out of the country. Right? That's the cartoon. And here's a chart that kind of shows and emphasizes the difference in numbers by decade between Northern and Western Europeans already here and Southern and Eastern Europeans already here. In 1924, they increased the requirement or decreased the percentage allowed, and they change it and they go back to 1890. Notice how the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans here drastically changes from 1910 to 1890. So 3% of this versus 2% of that. Again, trying to keep people from that part of the world out. It favors Northern and Western Anglo-Saxon societies, countries, people of that descent, that kind of thing. All right, the National Origins Act, again, is something that excludes Japanese, 100% of Japanese people. 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act, as I mentioned before. This does not include Canadians or people from Mexico. Actually, the numbers of Canadians and Mexicans incoming to the country increased here with this, and both of them, especially Mexicans, being desirable for the as a piece of the workforce in our economy at that point in time. An example of the radicalism and anti-non-Americanism, Nativists' response is the SACCO and VANZETTI trial. Fear of foreigners, discrimination against foreigners. SACCO and VANZETTI were recent immigrant shoemakers and fish peddlers from Italy. They were convicted of and accused of and convicted of robbery and murder, and they did admit to being anarchists and atheists, but despite flimsy evidence, they were electrocuted in the electric chair. Today, research says, and further investigation going through the evidence and this chain of events at the time, basically everybody's concluded that those people died for no reason. They were not guilty, but they were pegged. They were a scapegoat. Our national identity is changing in all this, right? So external fears, conflicts with outside the country, internal conflicts as well. Modern culture and ideas are combining with the growth and influence of urban cities, and it seems to be a threat to traditional fundamentalist religion in American society. Fundamentalist religion meaning, if the Bible says it, that's the way it was, this is how you should live your life, don't drink alcohol, then we don't drink alcohol, that kind of thing. Right? 1920 census for the very first time showed that 51% of the entire population is living in an urban area. So based on that, where is most of the political power? Urban America, more representatives in Congress. And rural America seems to be feeling that they're getting forgotten. And crime, prohibition, a response to all this, trying to clean things up. Organized crime seemed to be an example. Immigrants and immigrant people coming into the country influencing the vote in our elections as well. Not nearly as Northern and Western European and urban America as they are in rural America. The old ways seem to be falling apart. And again, being politically outnumbered in all of this trend. So we've got an urban society, corruption, crime, immoral behavior happening, and it's taking over. Then we have this thing called Darwin's theory of evolution. Science is starting to be an example, and this is the flagship, this is the key thing you need to remember about this cultural clash. Science in schools and universities, modern universities in the West, let me go ahead and fix this, are teaching evolution more and more all the time. And states are passing anti-evolution laws. And the ACLU basically gets this guy, John T. Scopes, to go ahead and teach a lesson about Darwin's theory of evolution because it clashes with the freedom, the right of expression, freedom of information, all that kind of thing. We'll represent you, we'll pay for your costs. He gets arrested. There's this massive trial in Dayton, Tennessee. And this becomes the symbol of the clash between rural and urban society, moral, immoral society. There's John T. Scopes. William Jennings Bryan of the Populist Democratic movement in the election of 1896 was the guy that, oh, here he is, Bryan, was the prosecutor, fundamentalist Christian. The issue became, is this about breaking the law or is this about freedom of speech? The court made it about breaking the law. The ACLU said this is about a law that is unjust. It prevents freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But for traditional America, this concept of Darwin, people came from and developed from monkeys and, evolved over time from other animals and things as opposed to being created by God, and the story of Genesis, that kind of thing, was a threat to the youth of the country. It was a threat to the family. If we're derived from animals, then we're the same as animals, and animals just breed and interbreed together all over the place, and there's no rules, so therefore the whole marriage thing would seem to be threatened. This thing was broadcast on national radio, live. People heard it across the country. It was the big event of the decade in terms of this fight between good, bad, and evil in the country. In the end, he's convicted of breaking the law. He's fined $100, slap on the wrist. That's about it. Doesn't go to jail at all. And Bryan seems to be very humiliated and testified as a religious expert in this particular case as well, and they're not happy. Right? Should have been a much harsher penalty in all this. And so John T. Scopes basically gets off with not a whole lot. His fee of $100, I believe, was paid by the ACLU. And so this is a big deal. Organizations are formed against it, Anti-Evolutionary League, all that kind of thing. So that wraps up our topic, Prohibition, Intolerance, Nativism in the 1920s. Make sure you read through your documents on the Mexican Americans and what life was like for Mexican Americans in the 1920s, and that you read through your Prohibition article. You've got your left side snap chart. Make hay.